Hi guys, so I spoke to Neale Richmond, member of the Irish Dáil or Parliament. He's also Fine Gael's spokesperson on European affairs. We talked about Brexit, Northern Ireland, the rise of Sinn Féin, the UK's path back to Europe, and of course Scotland. Great. So Neale, can you I think we'd like to start off with, for example, United Ireland. So do you see that happening in the next 10 years?
I don't necessarily see a United Ireland happening in the next 10 years. I do see it happening in my own lifetime. For context, I'm 38. I hope to live a while longer. But I can see us being faced with the prospect of a border poll within the next decade. And this isn't necessarily something I would have thought feasible 5 or 6 years ago. I think Brexit has completely changed the direction that's going in. And I also think the longer this particular British government stays in office, I can easily see them calling a border poll or indeed a Scottish independence referendum, very much in without consulting other partners and just doing it. And there's a sort of a kind of I dare you to do it. So we have the Assembly elections in May. As it stands, we'll probably see a nationalist First Minister elected. I think that'll be an interesting time to watch, but I certainly think that there is a prospect of a border poll is very, very strong in the next decade.
Like we tend to focus mainly on Northern Ireland, but what about in the Republic? What is the sort of level of support for a United Ireland in the Republic of Ireland?
Yeah, so it's a bit mixed depending on the opinion polls, but it's roughly around the 60% mark. But it's a very soft 60%. And that declines when you start going, well, are you prepared to pay extra taxation for it? Are you prepared to make various other sacrifices? That's actually a massive challenge. A lot of people think, well, the border poll, it's all about convincing that middle in Northern Ireland, perhaps the people who now vote Alliance, because neither nationalists or unionists have a majority anymore. But I fundamentally believe, and where I hope to see my role in any future referendum campaign is convincing people in the Republic that this is a good thing for them, demystifying a lot of the hot takes. People would say that, we can't afford the £9 billion subsidy or whatever it is, Westminster. But if you actually break it down and you look at the economic modelling and you look at the potential returns and indeed the opportunities that it presents for people in the Republic, it's something that really excites me. It's high level political discussion. It's statecraft at its very finest. And I think, there's going to be everything thrown at the prospect, not just from unionists, but from people down the Republic. Maybe they're of a different generation, or look, there's always 20% of people in the Republic who vote no in any referendum. So it's putting out a clear campaign, not taking it for granted. It's not about simply getting the nationalist vote out in the north, or indeed convincing that large block in the middle. It's going to be really, really hard work.
Like, for example, I think also sometimes we forget about the peace process in Northern Ireland, how the European Union fully supported it, the United States fully supported it, and also supported it economically. How much I don't even remember how many billions were pumped into Northern Ireland since the peace process began. And I'm pretty sure in a United Ireland would see something like that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, like the Peace 2 programme alone was worth €1.2 billion. There was huge economic and political support for the peace process from the European Union, and it's often dismissed by people in the UK, Brexiteers, unionists, which I think is really unfortunate, but not to be not that surprising. And you look at the work that John Hume did; he was as vociferous in getting European support as he was for American support for the process. Look, I think simply saying that the EU will provide financial assistance, I think that's actually a false narrative, and it's one we shouldn't be taken down because it's not an actuality and it's not a definite. The membership of the European single market, full membership, presents huge opportunities for United Ireland. At the moment we're a net contributor to the EU, which is very much a badge of honour for the Republic. Would a United Ireland stay a net contributor? Possibly would become a net recipient. You look at the numbers; they are fluid. But that's not necessarily it's not necessarily a good thing that Westminster gives an extra £9 billion to Northern Ireland every year. Where is the opportunity to grow the private sector economy in Northern Ireland, the research opportunities for their third level institutions? And I certainly think one thing that we can hang our hat on, and we can learn from, say, the difficulties of the Scottish independence referendum. Two massive issues came up in Scotland. One, the future of currency and the economic model. And the second one was potential membership of the EU. And Jose Manuel Barroso made a very clear intervention when he said, well, there's no guarantee in independent Scotland would join the European Union. Now that subsequently changed post-Brexit, and the Spanish and others have been very open to the prospect. But one thing Enda Kenny achieved, I think was the first, not the second European Council after the Brexit referendum, is the agreement that a united Ireland, using the German example, would be automatically part of the EU, which is a huge draw for the 54% of people who voted Remain in Northern Ireland.
Very good. Yeah, no, I agree. Let's move a little bit on to, for example, I'd like to focus a little bit more on Irish politics. Like Sinn Féin are rising in the polls at the moment, and at the following general election in the Republic of Ireland, would it be possible that we could see Mary Lou McDonald becoming Ireland's first Taoiseach? Or do you
see she could easily become the first female Taoiseach. I don't necessarily accept the narrative, and you'd say, of course you wouldn't, you're Fine Gael TD, that Sinn Féin are automatically destined for government. They're doing well in the opinion polls at the moment. A year ago, my party was on 37% in the opinion poll, so they are fluid. But more importantly, how they're getting the vote, they are taking votes steadily off potential coalition partners. 33% in a poll is a long way from a majority government. And when you have other parties of the left and hard left on very low single figures, it's hard to see how they form that government. And I get really frustrated with the online narrative that Sinn Féin were the real winners of the 2020 general election, or Mary Lou McDonald is the real Taoiseach. They only got 25%. Fianna Fáil got 24%, and my party got a little bit less. We have the government of today, the three-party government, has a fairly comfortable majority in the Dáil. We've never lost a vote. And I was in the Shannon last time when we had confidence in supply. So I think we have to be very clear on what the actualities is. Yes, there is a fair chance Mary Lou McDonald could be the first female Taoiseach. I don't think it's a given. And I think there's a good 2.5, 3 years to the next general election. I think things will change to an extent. The rise of Sinn Féin, I don't dismiss it. I understand it.
What would you say is the driving force behind the rise of Sinn Féin?
It's a mixture. They very much have tapped into the elixir of change.
Sorry, Neale, I can hear a beeping sound. I don't know if it's...
Yeah, sorry, it's the Shannon bells.
Oh, okay, no problem. Okay.
Hopefully, it adds to the authenticity of our chat. They'll stop in about a minute. Hopefully, it's not impacting too much.
No problem. Go ahead.
It happens quite a lot. Sorry about that. Look, the rise... The electoral support they got in 2020 was significant, and they tapped into understandable concern on a couple of issues, be it housing, insurance costs, and then people were looking for, well, what is the vehicle for change? In the 2019 local and European elections, that vehicle for change is very much the Green Party. Sinn Féin had a terrible local European elections in 2019. They lost 2 of their European seats. They lost a lot of their councillors. So they are still, between the pandemic and life in general, they have very much tapped into that change narrative. I would argue, and people can come back and that's fine, a very populist narrative, very simplistic narrative that, get Fine Gael out, they've been in government for over a decade, and together with Fianna Fáil it's over a century, and things will all be completely different. But I would argue that a lot of the proposals they make are, it's fancy economics. They're not necessarily realistic. And these are very political comments, and I know this isn't necessarily a very political chat. They've done some things very cleverly, and I say that as a politician. And we see this across the world. I don't think necessarily their rise is a certainty that they'll enter government. I don't think it's necessarily a sustainable one, or it'll merely continue. But it certainly provides very stark choices to the Irish people, and also provides a very stark challenge to centrist politicians like myself.
Like, for example, I don't mean to beat up on Sinn Féin, and we don't have Sinn Féin here to defend themselves, but one of the issues I see with them is the difference between the party in the north and the party in the Republic. And maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong on this assumption, but I get the impression that the party in the north is a bit more conservative, while the one in the Republic is a bit more left-wing. Would you agree or disagree with that?
No, I'd agree with that. And I think that's that follows a lot of their votes in the north. Things like a woman's right to choose. They had a very they had quite a journey on that, and there is different opinions in Northern Ireland compared to the Republic. Their approach to they're very much a party of government in the north, and they're quite establishment. Whereas at times in the south, they very much like to play the sort of the revolutionary line, be it globally in relation to places like Cuba and Catalonia, or more directly in terms of the rhetoric they put out. They're a lot more radical. They're a lot less radical in Northern Ireland. And I think there's also a lot of their policies in Northern Ireland are simply different in government than the policies they advocate for in the Republic. So there are contrasts there. To what extent people are interested in those contrasts, or consider that in terms of the context of an election, I'm not convinced yet.
I'd just like to go back to Northern Ireland for a moment. To what extent do you feel that Northern Ireland is being ignored by Westminster, by the Westminster government?
Completely. It's ignored utterly throughout the Brexit process. And like, I remember distinctly Enda Kenny as Taoiseach, Dara Murphy as European Affairs Minister, Charlie Flanagan as Foreign Affairs Minister, going over to campaign in the Brexit referendum. And that wasn't necessarily something people did very glibly, and making it quite clear that this is going to have a huge impact on the Good Friday Agreement. It's going to have a huge impact on life across Ireland. And it was just dismissed. It was dismissed not just by the English Brexiteers, but also the arch unionists and loyalists. And I think it was Ian Paisley this week in Westminster challenged Boris Johnson, do you even care about Northern Ireland? And we're kind of going like, well, you're only just catching up with what we've all known for the last 6 years. They don't care. There is a distinct lack of understanding about Ireland, particularly amongst the ERG. But I would be critical that there are elements in all parties in Westminster who don't always take into account the very real dynamics on the ground in Ireland or Northern Ireland. Not to the same extent. It's very pronounced in the government party, but it goes back to the classic. I've been to England 100 times in my life for various reasons. There's plenty of English people who've never been to Ireland, and this has always been an issue.
Yeah, just on the issue of Ian Paisley standing up in the House of Commons the other day, where he believed, I think the penny has finally dropped, and it's something I've always believed that the driving force behind the DUP support for Brexit was eventually to put a hard border on the island of Ireland and to hell with the consequences. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, no, I wonder if the DUP, if unionism had to come out strongly in favour of Remain, which was the easiest way to save the union, what would Sinn Féin have done? They've always been a Eurosceptic party heretofore. But no, genuinely, I think the DUP, and it was really quite pronounced during the 2 years when they had the balance of power, they got completely sucked in by the ERG mentality. They loved the limelight of the leave means leave, the very extreme element, fetting Donald Trump and things like that. Like the DUP, for people outside Ireland, I just don't think people really understand just how conservative they are. They are more conservative than anyone in the British Conservative Party on social issues, on global issues, and they've always, I remember there was a headline after that general election in 2017. It was the London Evening Standard, and it was Nigel Dodds and a couple others, and they were in their orange sashes in the picture, and the question is, here comes the Irish. I was like, these lads don't see themselves as Irish, and it just kind of went to the lack of understanding in Westminster, but also, it was the most Googled question, who are the DUP? And people started getting very concerned looking at answers in relation to creationism and dinosaurs and yes, these sort of things.
So let's move back to maybe the United Kingdom and EU membership. So obviously it's no longer a member, but what if the UK eventually did try to rejoin the European Union? Do you see full membership? Do you see just membership of the single market and the customs union? What sort of process needs to take place before, support at the moment seems to be growing for rejoining, especially as we're seeing what's happening at the ports, for example, at Dover. People are getting angry. What is the process to rejoin, and what are the sort of problems that could be thrown in their way?
I'd love for the UK to rejoin the EU, and I'd be very open about that. I will segue to I think it's more likely that an independent Scotland or a United Ireland could possibly talk about European membership before the UK looking to rejoin. There is many obstacles in their way. The first and foremost is a political one. And it goes back to the history. Like, you have from the UK's application to join the EEC initially in the 60s was rejected. It was rejected by de Gaulle. It was only when Pompidou came to power that they actually he removed that veto and said, you know what, we'll consider them. We're not talking about any other country. It's one of the largest economies in the world. It has a huge influence on global politics in terms of defense, security. So it's not like you're considering an application from a Croatia or a Romania or a Bulgaria. This is a big beast in global politics. It's a G7 country. But I could easily see certain elements, be it in France or Italy or somewhere else, saying that, actually, you know what, when they were members, they weren't fully dialed in. They never were. The first thing that the UK did after joining in 73 was have a referendum to leave in 75. And there was so many opt-outs provided. David Cameron got his reforms prior to the Brexit referendum, that I do think there'll be considerable internal opposition from those who possibly have a more federalist bent within the EU. And the last 6 years have been particularly bruising. Those of us who are passionate Europeans have been called everything under the sun by the Brexiteers, often incorrectly, often falsely. And they don't always understand that we speak pretty good English in Europe. We watch the BBC, we read the British newspapers, and we see them on social media. In terms of, I think there is definitely an appetite for closer engagement, closer membership closer, not membership, but closer relationships that was offered throughout the Brexit discussions. You kind of remember Michel Barnier's chart of various options that were open in terms of a Norway-style agreement or a Canada-style agreement. Joining EFTA would be something that certainly was talked about by many. Don't necessarily know how the Norwegians would feel about that, going from the big beast in EFTA to all of a sudden the UK coming in. But it would require a fundamental shift in thinking in the UK as well.
What do you think from a political point of view within the UK, for example, getting rid of first past the post or something like that? Do you see that being a requirement? Or, for example, some people have touted that the UK would have to join the euro. I don't believe that's the case. I don't know whether you'd agree or not.
Well, definitely, there'd be no requirement to change first past the post. European member states have lots of different ways of electing their MEPs, let alone their national parliaments. We use PRSTV in Ireland for our MEPs. Some people use an open list, some people use a closed list, some people do use regional kind of round elections. We think of the French election coming up and how they elect their president. Now, the Copenhagen criteria is suitably vague in terms of euro, and this is something that comes up in Scotland a lot. And there is a sort of a genuine aspiration that new EU member states would like to join the Eurozone and the euro. Most do. You talk to people in Croatia, they quite fancy being in the euro. They quite like the idea. The Danes have stayed outside it. The Swedes, correct me if I'm wrong, have stayed outside it. There was no issue with the UK staying outside the euro. Personally, I'm delighted Ireland is in the euro. From a sheer practical point of view, I go to Paris in the morning, don't need any foreign exchange. It's great. I know exactly what I'm paying for my lunch tomorrow. It's a rugby weekend, so I'll say lunch above board. So I don't see that as being a huge objection. It is the political mindset, be it within the European institutions or certain member states, that you're opening the door back to a former member that was many times a difficult member state for many reasons, not always the most difficult. But what's the point in letting them in if they decide they want to go out again? I think a far bigger issue, and I'm sure it's very disappointing news to those of a pro-European Remainer background in the UK, that I can't see the mindset changing that much. Like the amount of, I found the last couple of years before the pandemic, traveling over to England could be quite difficult. Lots of people who had voted Remain, maybe not that enthusiastically, were quite bitter because they bought into the narrative that the UK was being punished or that Ireland was being difficult. Really, really craven media approach to Brexit. And even this week, we see Jacob Rees-Mogg appointed minister responsible for Brexit opportunities. Like, there is a very clear disinformation campaign going out there trying to say, actually, no, Brexit's allowing us to do X, and we're the fastest growing economy in the G7, completely ignoring the massive decline that went to 6 months prior.
No, I agree. Yeah.
How many times do we hear about the vaccine rollout? It's complete nonsense, but it's sticking. And the British traditional media and social media have bought into the narrative, and there's enough people in that 40 to 50% who are, well, you know what, we voted for it, let's stick with it. And the only reason Brexit isn't a success is because of the French.
What do you think about Labour's position on this? Labour has been talking about fixing Brexit or making Brexit work. I don't know if they truly believe that or they're just using it as a tactic. Of course, Brexit can't work; it needs to be undone because it's obviously failed. It's broken.
Yeah, like that. Like I said it a million times. I even have it on a mug beside me. There's no such thing as a good Brexit. All it is a matter of damage limitation. And certainly a lot of things that Keir Starmer spoke when he was their Brexit spokesperson, a lot of the things he advocated then were quite realistic and actually, yeah, would have limited the impact of Brexit. Um, and I would certainly hope that they would offer an idea of a closer relationship. And, it wasn't necessarily just obviously the Lib Dem position changes, they're very small. Like your mainstream conservatives, particularly in the last parliament, and there is still a rump of them around, none of them are in cabinet, good, decent conservatives that were pro-European. I think there is an appetite that actually, hold on, we do need a closer relationship with our closest geographic ally. And the situation in Ukraine kind of presents the challenges in the region. I think there are lots of common sense parliamentarians in Labour and in Conservatives. However, Boris Johnson still has a massive majority, and until that changes, it really doesn't matter what Labour says in so many regards.
But I think you're hitting on a valid point there about how it's not just the parties have to change, but also the mentality in the country has to change, and that could, you could see the Tories being removed at the next election, but the mindset in the media as well, in the public, has to change. I just like to just focus on one more issue, and then I will let you go. Just your opinion on Scottish independence, and I know Ireland is a huge supporter of an independent Scotland rejoining or joining. I don't know which term we should use, the European Union. But do you see any stumbling blocks for an independent Scotland joining? And what is your opinion on Scottish independence?
Well, I'll answer your last point first, because I don't have an opinion on Scottish independence. That is a matter for the Scottish people. I would have been, and I'll be very frank, in the first Scottish independence referendum, I was really concerned about independence because I thought, Scotland outside the UK makes Brexit inevitable. Brexit happened anyway, so it's a moot point now. What I've been very clear, and about any time I've spoken in Scottish media, is this: if Scotland were to vote for independence, and it's completely a matter for themselves, and there's lots of arguments that they need to resolve that they haven't resolved domestically, in terms still of in relation to currency, in relation to defence, in relation to the border with England, lots of things that you learn something from Brexit. You need to know the result of what you're voting for. It's fine. We have a lot of referenda in Ireland. We've got some right, we've got some wrong, but certainly the last two that we've had that have been quite controversial in relation to abortion and marriage equality, we knew exactly what we were voting for, and that enabled that the result was decisive and it was accepted by society as a whole. The main obstacles to an independent Scotland joining the EU have been removed. The concern of the Spanish government has been removed. It's no longer comparable to Catalonia. They have to prove that their economic model, there's 13 Copenhagen criteria. I think the Scots would probably get 10 or 11 without even trying. And what I have always said, that if Scotland were to vote independence, and it's solely in their prerogative to vote yes or no, and I will watch that referendum from afar, keenly interested, but I wouldn't get involved in it. But if they were to vote for independence, I would be the first person banging on the door of the Commission saying we need to start accession talks, because it is fundamentally in Ireland's interest to have another common law English-speaking jurisdiction of a similar size in the European Union. Lots of people try to say that I'm anti-British, and I'm not in any which way. I'm very anti-Brexit, and there's a massive difference. I actually love the UK. Lots of family in England and in Scotland. Travel over to watch Arsenal regularly, play cricket, all that. English people are brilliant, but I don't like Brexit. And the same with Scotland. The comparison is when the UK left the EU, Ireland lost a massive ally. We coordinated a lot with the British government in areas like taxation, in areas like spending and cooperation. It's the same. We always rely on the French when it comes to the CAP. The UK were a far bigger ally, particularly then with partners in the Netherlands and Belgium. Scotland would be another ally now, not of the size of the UK, but it would be great for Ireland, because the EU is all about internally alliances, and a lot of them come down to cultural experiences, shared history, shared economic models, and certainly, as I said, Scotland would be a very productive member of the EU. I think it, of course, would be good for Scotland, but most importantly, it's not my barbecue, so it's not my decision to make.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, Neale, for speaking with me today.
No, I really enjoyed it, and best luck to yourself.
Thanks a lot.